Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with Us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Daniel Quinn and Courtney Staples. On today's episode, we have an interview with Dungeon Masterpieces Baron de Ropp. But before we get into that, we always want to remind you that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, follow the instructions, and we'll build your world live on air. If you want to follow us on social media, we're over on Twitter at Let's Worldbuild. If you want to come join our Discord community, or you're feeling particularly generous and want to give us money on Patreon, you can find a link for both of those in the description. Also, if you just really want the sweet, sweet patron-only episodes, they're there too. Anyway, on to the interview. Hello, friends, and today we are joined by Baron de Ropp of Dungeon Masterpiece. Baron, so glad to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for those of us who might not know you too well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, what would you like to know? I could wax poetica for, 45 minutes about myself.
It's your podcast. If you want to give us the entire life story, the autobiography of Baron de Ropp, I'd love to sit here and listen. So maybe specifically why you might be on this podcast, but, tell us everything that you want.
Okay. Well, I'm here because you reached out to me, and this is a world building podcast, which I definitely have an affinity for. In fact, I would say that was probably the bulk of my early RPG experience. I started playing role playing games when I was in middle school. I was 9 years old. In fact, my first role playing game was not Dungeons and Dragons. It was a Big Eyes Small Mouth derivative of what is the anime? Good lord, I can't even remember. Sailor Moon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I'm actually not like I don't have a problem with very specific animes, but like I would not consider myself an anime fan by any stretch of the imagination, right? But that was kind of my first foray, and once I had that experience, it was I can use these rules to tell stories about worlds with my friends. This is so cool. And then I had a friend who just gave me his Dungeons and Dragons second edition books. Just outright gave them to me in science
Oh,
class.
wow.
And I asked him why he was doing this. It was because his mother said that they were of the devil and he had to get rid of them. So he didn't want them to go in the dumpster. So I became the beneficiary. And those two things kind of solidified my start into the practice. But truth be told, I didn't really do a whole lot of like sit down, play Dungeons and Dragons through the vast majority of my middle school years. It was more just, Cold War world building, especially with Big Eye Small Mouth rule sets like Big Robots Cool Starships. It's who can build the bigger starship, who can build the bigger space station, and it was just, playground nonsense effectively. But it was a load of fun. It's probably the only enjoyable part of my middle school experience. And I mean that very blatantly. That is not rhetoric. But then I really started getting into the like shared narrative, shared collaborative storytelling in high school. That's really when I started to play like D&D the air quote way it was designed. And third edition had just come out as well, which, being a slightly geeky, a very geeky, kind of math nerdy kid, all the crunchiness of third edition was just amazing to me.
Oh, yeah.
I look back at it now and I disgust myself with how immature I was at that time. But so that's probably when I first started playing D&D, and I played every week for nearly 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Took a break and got married and just dealt with, changing family life, and then started playing again. I probably took like a 3 or a 4 year break from role playing games in general. And I remember telling my wife at the time, we're divorced now, but at the time I remember telling her, I was like, I really miss world building. I want to get back into that. So I just started building my own campaign setting. Next thing you knew, I was, going through a divorce, and D&D was, a very cathartic and constructive method of dealing with, just personal anxiety and building a lot of friendships
Mhm.
along the way, and
Mm.
I was playing D&D 3 days a week.
Oh,
I don't know
wow.
how I had time to do it, but yeah, and 3 different campaign
Wow.
settings that I had written too.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, it was wild. I've cooled off now, I'm only playing 2 days a week, but, yeah, so I got into YouTube, started my YouTube channel, Dungeon Masterpiece, because, I've played a lot, and
3 days a week is a
3
lot
days a week
for
is
me. Yeah, that's yeah.
it's a lot, and I was like, "I've got all this wealth of experience," but I'm glad I didn't start it when I first started thinking about a
Mm.
D&D YouTube experience because I would have just completely wasted everyone's time. But, I remember watching Hanker and Fernell, then Drunkens and Dragons, now Runehammer, and, he was the first person on YouTube or, like, in general, the first person to get me to understand that rules of the game are something more than air. Like, I had just taken for granted that the rules are there and this is the way we play,
Mhm.
and what those rules mean as far as like the meta narrative or the meta construct that is the game. Like there's a certain contract that we agree to when we play by a certain rule set, and him really showing that to me made me step back from wanting to do the YouTube channel for probably oh 8 years until I really
Wow.
started to think through like what my relationship is with the game. How do I relate to the very tactile aspects of the game that I feel a lot of people take for granted and don't even recognize are there. So anyway, that's the long-winded version of how I got here,
Mhm.
with the Dungeon Masterpiece YouTube channel and how I'm here today. I've spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, communication theory, geopolitics, which I'm sure we'll get into more, and various, hegemonic systems and how that can be used to influence storytelling.
Mm.
But
Mhm.
yeah, anyway, I've rambled on long enough.
I've actually gotta ask a question about your YouTube format because I
Yeah.
was really surprised and pleasantly surprised, that is, at how short and concise your videos are, and I just love your emphasis on that, like, less is more approach. How
Yes.
did you decide on that minimal format, especially in this kind of sea of long form videos that are going up?
So I have a background in, let's see here. Let me restate this. This is a really good question. Okay, so I come from a marketing background, but by trade, I'm also a data engineer.
Mhm.
And this has afforded me the ability to work with people in marketing and get into the gritty mechanics and understand much better how the algorithm actually works. Like there's a lot of nonsense about, what people say the algorithm is.
Mhm.
I've written AIs. I understand how they work. And then I've also got the insights of the marketing team that I work with in my normal day-to-day job. And really what it boils down to is people want long form content because they want something that they can be engrossed in.
Mhm.
But they also want short form content because it's easy to listen to. And I got to this point where I was consuming a bunch of D&D content like, about 8 years ago, 5 years ago on the platform. And the only person who I felt like could really deliver long form content and actually provide meat was Matthew Colville.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sure there are others out there. I just haven't found them. The algorithm has not been smart enough to shove them in my
Mhm.
face. So, if there are, leave links in the description, guys. I want to know where they are. I don't even know if you can leave links in a description in the podcast. Uh
You can, but only we read them, so it's a
okay.
little
Yeah,
different.
yeah. So never mind then. uh but I also found that people were trying to milk this gamification of the algorithm with like,
Mhm.
15 to 20-minute videos about the inspiration mechanic, you know. And I don't want to come off as derogatory to the people that make content like that, because that's absolutely not a slight. In fact, I find it absolutely awe inspiring that another YouTuber like Jenny D can produce a meaningful, well thought out 15-minute video about inspiration mechanics.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
that blows my mind. There's no way I could do that. But I feel like there's a lot of things that are not talked about, but I also don't want to waste anyone's time.
Mm.
Like, I feel like on this podcast here, you're going to hear me wax poetica, and I get really good at just rambling and just getting on a train of thought. So, like, I have a note on my paper as I'm sitting here right in front of me that says "shut up" to remind myself to shut up.
Well, here's a question for you. Since you mentioned having some experience with algorithms in particular, and we know that you are interested in geopolitics, why don't you tell our listeners what's your background? Like, what do you specialize in outside of the podcast?
Okay, so my day job is I'm a data engineer. I have experience working with artificial intelligence. No, that's not like me trying to build myself up as some sort of like Silicon Valley genius, because people who say that they talk about AI are like, you know, there are really, really smart people who write very complicated algorithms. I am not one of those people, but I have enough exposure to understand how they work and how to build very rudimentary ones. I also work with just marketing data systems in general. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and what's your interest in
And
geopolitics?
geopolitics.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd always been a history nerd, right? Like, I love consuming history, but I feel like the biggest. Okay, so let's step back for just a minute here. So geopolitics is not what it sounds like. People hear the word politics in the word, and they immediately think that we're going to start talking about which president we voted for, and that's absolutely not the case. Geopolitics is the study of how geography or land masses influence the way that cultures and societies develop, and how that geography recontextualizes the way those different cultures and societies interact with each other. And something that I feel like is largely overlooked, at least in like the high school and middle school, and from my experience, even in like the level 100, level 200 classes of history classes in universities, is nobody talks about how geopolitics influences history. And we have this ridiculous adage of history repeats itself. Well, nobody stops to ask themselves why. you know
Mhm.
like,
It's almost as though the land masses don't really change very much over time. It's
exactly.
wild.
And when they do, you feel it. Like, there's a sudden
Oh yeah.
shift in the geopolitics. So, nobody stops to wonder, like, what are the ramifications of the fact that I live next to a mountain? What are the
Mhm.
ramifications of the fact that I live in the inner city? It's really interesting, because if you live near the mouth of a river that is relatively safe from ocean currents, and that river flows through a flat basin of land all across the world, you're going to find a massive city there. It's almost without fail. You're always going to find a massive city there. And what does that actually mean? Like, why does history repeat itself? Why do political hegemonies always try to jockey for positions of power over specific types of land masses and land forms? And that's kind of what the study of geopolitics dives into, and discusses how the world that we live in today is not just shaped by the people that came before us, but specifically how those people came before us were shaped by the geography that they lived in. So, and we can talk about that for 3 hours.
I think that last couple of sentences is a really good summary, like to grasp it, like
Yeah.
how it's,
Yeah.
it's about how the
Mhm.
environment has shaped the way we have formed our cultures and
Mhm.
interactions with each other.
Right.
And I think like what's really interesting in the videos that I've seen you do is especially the one specifically about that, is it shows how as a world builder, that's a factor you have to consider, when you're putting together a realm, even if the realm is highly fantastical, it
Mm.
seems like there's
Right,
certain quote
right.
unquote logic built into human nature that would be affected by resources on the map and river mouths and,
Right.
and
Mhm.
climates and such like that.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yep. And as of recording, I think that you have a trio of geopolitical like videos right now. One is in Faerun, the other is in the Dark Sun setting, and the third one I'm blanking on because I don't have YouTube pulled up right now.
No, the third one is just kind of a overview of how rivers are the bedrock of
Right.
Yeah.
geopolitical existence.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I think anyone who's played Civ at any point in the last 10 years can probably tell you the exact same thing, or at least something very close to it.
Right.
But I too am a big history nerd. I've never really dipped my toe into geopolitics outside of like a vague anthropological study of it, like Jared Timon's Guns, Germs, and Steels, like very rudimentary stuff, right?
Mhm.
For anyone who's interested in looking at geopolitics and then translating it to a fantastical setting or just in general, where would you recommend they start? And what are some like favorite books that you could really point to and be like, oh my God, I can tell you about this book for 3 hours?
Oh.
Mind you, our podcast is only an hour, so maybe, not do that, but tell us about them at the very least.
Right, right. Let's see. I don't have any key definitive book for geopolitics applied to a world building or fantasy setting. In fact, I'm not sure that that exists. Of course, I'm probably wrong. It's probably out there, but I've not
You
seen
should write
anything.
it.
I guess that means I should write it.
Yeah.
Yeah. we have a friend of a podcast who just came out with his magic blueprint. CR Rowanson, he is the magic engineer on YouTube. He is fantastic, and he just came out with his how to build any magic system book. And again, if you want to do that book, you're more than welcome to come back on and promote it. We can talk about it if you want. I mean, there's all sorts of things we can talk about here, Baron, but please, I interrupted. Continue.
No, so as far as a book to sink your teeth into what I would call modern geopolitics, that is like the understanding of how our world is shaped today and where it is going in the near term future. Uh, phenomenal read is Disunited Nations by Peter Zian.
Ooh.
It talks about how the kind of the policies that have guided NATO security through the Cold War are now losing steam and losing momentum, and how American policymakers have largely become disinterested in international uh, foreign policy, and how our absence on the world stage as Americans is impacting global trade, and really kind of what this means for the next 20 or 30 years going forward, and how like a possible serious breakdown in international trade could very well upset what we have all taken for granted as the status quo around the world, with free trade and safe waters to do that trade on. Very very interesting book, but he dives into like each kind of regional area on every continent and talks about some of the major key hegemonic players, talking about India, China, Turkey,
Mhm.
Europe and Germany, Russia, America, Brazil, and Argentina, and just kind of breaks apart like this is what their geography has set them up for success or failure for in the years to come.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Like I immediately went and put it on a wish list. I'm like wrapped in attention. I'm like, oh man, that sounds amazing. That sounds really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that you can sit there and on premise that might not sound the most appealing to a lot of people, right? Especially when you're talking about fantastical worlds, when you're talking about dungeon masters, when you're talking to storytellers, that might not sound all that interesting, except how could it not when you could plug the same kind of core concepts into
Mhm.
any setting, any world, any story? And to me, when I see stuff like this, when I read books like this, it is nothing but fuel for the creative fire. It is truly inspirational to me that you can take a concept, drill down to its basic components and be like, okay, now this applies to this magical setting, this applies to this magical nation. Because
Right.
I always see them as these are universal concepts that will always play in
Mhm.
any story that you're trying to tell.
100%. And just to that end, because I know a lot of people struggle with like what are the ramifications of magic in my setting, like
Mm-hmm.
and honestly that's kind of why I have like a secret heartburn problem with Eberron just in general, like if everybody's magical nobody's magical type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
if if people struggle with, the believability of the ramifications, I truly invite them to look at the geopolitics of Saudi Arabia and
Mm.
study their history, because it wasn't until an oil tycoon went out there and started poking around in the desert and found a crap ton of oil that all of a sudden Saudi Arabia became one of the most important countries
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of our era. You know, up until then, it was just a huge bank of sand on the coast of the Indian Ocean. As far as its landmass importance, it was just a desert. So,
Mm-hmm.
swap out crude oil in place of any other thing that would be important, and just think of it like it's oil.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mhm.
it's mana crystals, okay. If it's Vespin gas, okay. It doesn't
Exactly.
matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what it
Exactly.
is. Whatever it is, people want it and they want lots of it. And there's only so much to go around.
Mm-hmm.
It also makes me wonder too that knowing certain principles as far as kind of how rational actors behave with respect to like geopolitics would help you kind of construct truly either alien or non-human cultures too, because you
Mhm.
could select
Mm.
a culture and say, well, this particular behavior is typical for humans, but for this particular either fantasy race or this particular even like other human culture or alien species, if it's a spacefaring sort of thing, totally violates this concept, and what are the consequences of that. I wonder like if we can think of any settings that do that, or like that are based on that kind of thinking.
Ooh, that's a good
Mhm.
thought. I hadn't really thought about it from like an ecological perspective and
Mm-hmm.
other like species or speciation. But
Hmm.
it kind of I guess geopolitics is the human social component of natural
Mm-hmm.
selection. If you think about it like that,
Right.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it makes me like you're gonna build like an alpha race or something that's really truly alien. Like what is it that they do that's just fundamentally not normal with human behavior, and that could be one way to look at it from like a geopolitical point of view, I guess.
Right.
Absolutely. That's a great lens to look
Mhm.
at it,
Mhm.
Daniel. I mean, one of the common gripes that I always harp on is fantasy races are never fantastical enough. They're always just like reskinned humans a lot of the time. And I feel like through the lens of geopolitics, you could actually probably make it so it's a lot more alien or different, as you're suggesting. Like, as something as simple as this race doesn't need nearly as much water. Therefore, you're far more likely to find them away from they don't need to be near a fresh water source
Right.
nearly as much as humans might. And so all of a sudden, your map changes entirely if this area is. I mean, there's so much that you
They
can do
break the
there.
rules. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly,
exactly.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Once you start breaking the rules, then it's like, oh, cool. Now we really get to make things interesting and different. And I think
Mhm.
this is an excellent way to look at that because from a more modern perspective, right? That race who doesn't care about fresh water might be more willing to sell their fresh water rights to other races who
Yeah.
might not actually need it.
Mhm.
And you can take that not just from a fantastical viewpoint, but expand that out to an intergalactic. If we're doing sci-fi for whatever godforsaken reason, then you can take that
Hey, hey.
and you can expand upon that in like a planet to planet type thing too. I just think that there's so much interesting stuff that we can get into here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can even kind of look in like what is it, the ocean depths in the Marianas Trench.
Mhm.
Am I
Yeah.
crazy? But the steam vents, like geothermal steam vents, and there's like
Right.
crabs
Yeah.
that cling to the sides of these vents
Mm,
because they need the sulfur. And no other species on the planet is like that. So, what does that mean for the culture of crabs that live there? You know?
yeah. I think this is such a great starting point for anyone who's world building and really wants to make the other fantastical races that much more unique. Look at where they're going to be living and how and why that affects them and why and how it might affect their neighbors, for example. I think
For
that's a
sure.
great starting
Mhm.
point.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend to checking out, the Your Fantasy Map is Already Full of Quest Hooks video on Dungeon
Oh
Mastery. It's
yeah,
just like a quick, like, 10-minute or so just overview of how many things can just come off of a really simple map of an area.
absolutely. Yeah. I can also strongly recommend that one. It actually kind of reminds me of Dale Kingsmill, who we've had on the show. She's great. She has a video on sperm, which I always recommend people check out. It's not called that for obvious reasons, but it's basically you take any region and you break it down into social, political, religious, and military, right? Like you look at the lens for each settlement and like, okay, what's the conflict surrounding a social conflict, a political conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how you really get to flesh that out. I think that there's something here that we can do as well with I missed the E in sperm, which is economic. Apologies. But it's still there, right? Like I think that you can take a look at that and you can apply that to geopolitics as well. And I'm already getting super excited about this conversation. So
For sure.
yeah.
I mean, if you had to give us like, and I know this is stuff you do in your videos, so it would be cheating, but if you had to give us five principles, like a
Ooh.
SPERM acronym, right, from geopolitical survey for world building, what would be ones that world builders should like consider off the bat?
Okay, so instead of principles, it would be more of like what are a few questions that you have to be able to answer
Mm.
to make your world have geopolitical cohesion. And that is, where are your civilizations and why are they there?
Mhm.
Nice.
And that is answered by, and if we're going off of a normal human existence, a civilization needs a couple of things to survive. They need flat land that they can do agriculture on. They need a river running through that flat land that will help them irrigate that land so that they can divert some of their own labor onto other crafts and trades and other skilled professions away from agriculture, because otherwise you're just,
Mhm.
foragers.
Mm.
And then that river enables other nearby communities to trade on that river because you can float your commodities up and downstream on a boat. And that's way cheaper than doing it with a horse and buggy. Way cheaper because you have to feed a horse, right?
Mhm.
Then the next thing you need some sort of physical or geographical barrier that makes your civilization that you have developed with this river and flat land secure, right? So you need ideally either a very imposing mountain chain or you need a ocean that is extremely hard to get across to protect where where you physically are located on the planet. And if you have all of those things, you become a secure superpower. It is extremely difficult. It is extremely difficult for it doesn't matter what your internal policies are, what your population's ideologies are. It does not matter what those things are. You can ascribe to any ism you want. If you have those things, you are almost doomed to great success. So, and those are kind of like the principles of what does a civilization need to succeed. And then you start sticking all those different civilizations that you have next to one another and to analyze, what do they all have for success and what do they not have,
Mhm.
because there's only so much earth to go around.
Mhm.
Mm.
So your understanding of a society's geopolitics is, well, if these two river systems, let's say for example, I'm just going to frame China for example, the Pearl
Mhm.
River and the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Those are like the three major river systems in China. Well, they have a lot of land in between them, and the mouths of those rivers are very distant from one another. So, but they're also protected by, the Himalayan mountains and the desert. So all three river systems are in this big, huge bowl, right? They're almost entirely protected from invasion from the outside. They almost never get invaded. The Mongols were the only nation to invade China all across human history.
Mm.
Nobody else did it. But they've constantly, constantly been at war with each other because there's no
Mhm.
intersecurity between those things. So
Mhm.
the only way that whole region can remain secure is if some warlord is constantly going around and making sure everybody is, beat into submission to make sure nobody gets any funny ideas.
Mm.
Mhm.
And anytime that becomes unstable, it's over. The whole
Mm.
Chinese mainland has erupted into war. Like we even
Mhm.
have periods of Chinese history called like the Five Kingdoms, 10 Dynasties, or the Three Kingdoms periods. Like
Yep.
these are all like very indicative of the kind of insane bloodshed that has been spilled because of that lack of geographical security
Mhm.
from in between those river systems.
Absolutely.
And that's also because the mouths of those rivers are so distant from one another. It's very hard to travel by boat all the way up the Yellow Sea or all the way up the China Sea to get to your would-be neighbors. So, on the flip side of that, look at France. They have almost the same geography. They're in a mountain bowl protected by the Alps and two other mountain ranges. I can't remember the name of them. They're small, but they kind of provide a border between Germany, the Alps, the Pyrenees, and two other ones that split Germany and France. And they have two major river systems. What is it? The Seine and oh, it starts with an L. My geography is escaping me all of a sudden. But but the mouths of those rivers are also very close together. So it's very easy to, well, I'm just going to hop down this other river system after a 2-day trip
Mhm.
on the shore of the ocean and go do some trading on this river, and then I'll be back in 2 weeks. So the ability to do cultural exchange between those two river systems because their mouths are so
Hmm.
close together is very easy to do. And they're also very protected from outside invasion. And that's why the only time, the only time France has had like a serious regime change was when a populist movement in the 1700s couldn't decide if they wanted to be ruled by a republic, a despot, or a monarch. And I'm talking about the French Revolution that led
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
Napoleon Bonaparte, and then finally the institution of the French Republic. And like that was an extremely tumultuous period in time caused by other geopolitical factors. But for almost 1,000 years, that was the status quo. It was a very secure, very stable in France for that reason.
One of my favorite Charles de Gaulle quotes is it's basically on how the people of France are ungovernable. And it's because how can anyone rule a region with so many types of cheese? And I love that quote for many reasons, but it sounds silly until you break it down. It's like, wow, it's actually talking about how complex and rich and like really multivariate all of the regions in France are. And it sounds silly on its face until you start to realize it's like he's talking about the mountainous regions. He's talking about like all the different as we're discussing the geopolitical implications of these regions in France and how it makes all of these people so hard to interact with and have such drastically different viewpoints. But again, it's a great summation of what we're trying to talk about here, I think.
Right. Well, to that end, like what's interesting about that is that everybody has all these very different cultural or ethnic, you know, polities within France, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And you can absolutely see that. But because their commerce is so deeply rooted with each other, that the concept of like a destabilizing hot war is just so astronomically ludicrous because it would destabilize the very thing that France has built over the past millennia. So,
Hmm.
the fact that there are all these kinds of cheese is a testament to the security,
Hmm.
because if there were, take for example, a country that is very insecure, geopolitically insecure, Russia, they're only going to have a few
Mm.
kinds of cheese, right? Because you're you're only going to have like one large cultural hegemon that, has to do everything it can to control everything else or the whole thing just comes unglued.
Hmm.
And part of that is through trade. And so when you have, mandated trade, this is the way it's going to be. You have to adopt these cultural ideas so you get this kind of cheese. And that might sound like I'm talking about Sovietism, but the Tsarist Russia was the same way. Kievan
Absolutely.
Russia was the
Yeah.
same way. So,
Mhm.
these things happen this way for a reason.
Yes. I know that in particular in Brittany, right, like they believe themselves to be more Celts than French, and they
Right.
have like their festivals that happen to go on. And I imagine that imagine that type of spirit in Russia and how quickly it would get gobbled up by the state or at least quashed in large part by the state. This idea of a rebellious spirit that rejects the type of culture. I just don't see that happening in a place like Russia. But that's kind of neither here nor there. But still, I just think it's interesting to consider the implications of everything that we're talking about when we talk about geopolitics.
For sure.
Well, I'm sure that, look, I feel like we should probably pivot away from geopolitics. As much fun as I'm personally having, I know that we can probably talk a little bit more about games. And I partially brought you on because your video on Fate and the Fate Core RPG system. And I'm like, I saw the
Ooh.
geopolitics stuff. I saw some of the videos that you've done on like Skyrim and Diablo. I'm like, that's cool. And then you did a video about Fate. And I'm like, all right, he's coming on the podcast. We got to get him on. We got to talk about. I'm a big fan of Fate, powered by the apocalypse, and what they can do, not just narratively but mechanically. So please, can we wax poetic about that for just a moment?
Sure. What would you like me to say specifically? What would you like me to speak to?
Oh man. Give me the pitch for your preferred RPG system, and we can kind of go from there. I think is probably the best way we can go about this.
Well, it's not Fate.
That's
Uh,
fine. Mine's not Fate either.
right. I say that specifically because Fate, I feel like, is a great example of how game design could have worked if everybody was equally invested in
Mm,
the actual mechanics of the world and how their characters interrelated with it, rather than crunchy numbers they can get away with on a character sheet.
Mm.
And
mhm.
I mean that, like, I say that kind of with a bit of cynical rhetoric, but like even the casual gamers who are just excited to level up in a normal 5th edition D&D game, even players who just are totally casual and they just get excited to level up, and they hit 5th level and they get fireball because they're a sorcerer. Like, the fact that that's a thing has certain ramifications on the game and teaches people, and I think video games also do this to some extent. They just teach people to look forward to what they're going to get next on their character sheet, and
Mhm.
Fate Core
Mhm.
just throws all that out the window,
Absolutely.
which is a good thing as like a college thesis, but it's not practical. I feel like Fate was a PhD on game design that nobody will ever read.
Oh boy, that is that hurts me in a way that you don't even realize, because I remember trying to play Fate for the first time, and like just my players just not really vibing with it, not really digging, and admittedly me not really knowing how to run it. It is such a departure from a lot of the, I mean, I was running Pathfinder at the time, and to go from Pathfinder to Fate is like, oh boy, that is a vast different.
Yeah. Well, like, to that end, like, you can't there's not a single RPG out there that doesn't have some sort of, character. Like, I'm sitting here stammering to myself thinking, like, what would be an appropriate jumping off point to go from 5th edition D&D to Fate? Like, what is the middle ground there? And even Burning Wheel, I'm not even
Mm,
sure is
Mm.
that
Mm.
is that game.
I wonder, to answer your question, like you talk about in one of your videos dealing with a traditional OSR, how that was, it's like carrot cake. It's a totally different thing than the original OSR. It's like trying to change and improve on it rather than recreate it. But I wonder if there are some of the OSR adjacent games that form a bridge between the two. So some of the ones that are not trying to recreate old school play, but they're inspired by its simplicity, and yet they still do
Right.
some trad thing. So I wonder if there's some games in that space that you've encountered that you like.
So, yeah, actually, I am a huge fan, and just to show my bias here, I'm a huge fan of a subgenre of the OSR called the NSR, the New School Revolution, and it's kind of for those who are very unfamiliar with it because it's a very small community. It's kind of a understanding that, like, okay, the OSR is rose-colored glasses. Let's take the rose-colored glasses off and understand exactly what we were going to, like what
mm,
actually works. And then looking at, okay, if these are the things that work because of OSR, let's strip away all the stuff that didn't. And that's how you end up with, like, two of my favorite games right now are Mouse Ritter and Cairn, which are extremely similar to one another. Mouse Ritter is, imagine OSR mice living in like they are fantasy mice living in a mouse fantasy world, except the fantasy world is the modern mundane human world. Like
Mm,
Oh,
there's cars
mm,
driving on streets and you live in an apartment building or in a townhouse or some rich guy's mansion, but like the crows have scrying circles and you can go interact with frogs who are looking for the holy grail. um and cats are worse than dragons because you can't even kill them.
oh wow.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And Cairn is another game that is in that same vein of game design where the how do I describe this? It's kind of the same thing. The let me back up here. I would say that what makes the new school revolution distinct from OSR is that it understands that we're going to have a very light framework to play a game and to have a story, that story needs to be dangerous, that danger evokes a certain kind of storytelling, and we want to have as few rules as possible that help that storytelling shine, and then get rid of everything else.
mm,
Mm,
Usually there's also a hard lean into like random tables. And specifically, what I think is interesting here is that the random table that you use for whatever it is, the design of the random tables is just as important as your world building because it is seen as the world building,
mm,
mm,
if that makes sense. Like
mhm,
whatever you put in your random tables, whenever you want to roll, like what does this random spell that I'm making do? That has direct ramifications on the narrative of your game once somebody gets that randomly created magic item. And that's something that I'm not sure people quite get their heads around. It sounds really obvious when you say it with words, but until you sit down and you put only the most creepy, weird, dark, evil grimoire stuff on what can be in these pages in a evil spell book, do you really start to understand that? And when you take that much care into everything rather than like, oh, this random encounter table has 2d6 wolves on it. Moving on.
mm,
You can't let yourself be lazy with that kind of game design. So there's a lot more, I wouldn't say there's a lot. There's a decent more amount of work up front in your game preparation, but then everything is very smooth sailing, very light work after
mm,
that point.
mm. I think it speaks to like a OSR like tenet, which is like the GM as arbiter,
Yes.
rather than like an active participant, which I'm misrepresenting a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, I think that style of gameplay where the GM's like, I wrote all of this down, like the dice say what they say, and then they take the step back, so to speak. I think that speaks to it a little bit what you're talking about.
No, absolutely. So to that end, I would say that Karen and Mouse Ritter, the two authors, and I'm moderately well acquainted with one of the authors, Yukai Gal, who wrote Karen. The two authors would probably laugh and scoff that I said that they're air quote the same game. Um, but Karen and Mouse Ritter, and I would say Sean McCoy's Mothership.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mothership kind of falls into that area. I'd like to see where he goes beyond this first edition alpha-ish release. I'm extremely interested in that. But
Mm,
those are probably my go-to, like not just like my favorite games, but also like as game design ideological masterclasses. Like if I'm going to build my own system from scratch, what rules are important to me? And what rules do I need in order to guide the kind of story and narrative that I want to have? And then once I have those things, get rid of everything else because it doesn't matter.
mm.
mhm. And speaking of RPGs, and earlier you mentioned creepy dark things, you also have put out an RPG supplement, Hordes of Darkness. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So I got asked by some coworkers if we can play D&D, except it's Diablo. And I looked around and I found some like really old systems that
Mhm,
were like in second edition, and it didn't really work for fifth edition the way I wanted it to. So I extrapolated a few ideas, added some of my own. But the idea was like, what happens if you take fifth edition? And I think honestly, this is what fifth edition really does. like 5th edition is a war game, and
Yeah.
people get really upset when I say that, but 5th edition is a war game, and when you treat it like it's a war game, it's like Hero Quest on steroids.
Mm.
And when you treat it like that, it gets fun again. So I wanted to create like a random encounter system, a random treasure system that would just let you develop the most thin of absurdly ridiculous plot hooks of there is bad guy over there. We need kill him. Go. Like
Solid
Mhm.
plot,
broken
yeah.
English translation JRPG. And just let everybody kill a bunch of freaking monsters, man, and get really cool treasure that's way broken and overpowered, specifically so you can throw even more crazy monsters at them.
Oh
you know,
boy, yeah.
Mhm.
so the Diablo experience. So that's where that came from.
Awesome. Awesome.
Fantastic. I think with Diablo references out of the way, I think it's time that we pivot over to the world building jam. I would ask you if you're ready, Baron, but everyone knows that you're not. No one ever is. So we're going to go ahead, pull up the world building jam session, and we're going to roll some dice to see what we get.
Okay.
So the way that this works is that we're going to roll some dice that's going to determine the genre of the setting that we're going to be creating off the cuff today, the theme, and the first thing that we're focusing on. And Baron, as our guest, you're going to be the one who's going to be starting us off. So, rev your engines. Let's get this started. The first thing that we're going to be figuring out is the genre. And the genre that we're going to be focusing on for this scenario is going to be a noir detective story. So the theme surrounding this noir detective is going to be fury.
Okay.
And the thing that we're focusing on first is going to be a weapon. Appropriate, I think, all things considered.
That's extremely appropriate.
Yeah. So, Baron, start us off here. We've got a setting or a story that takes place within a noir detective setting or genre, I guess. We've got the theme of fury, and we're focusing on a weapon. So, where does your brain go? Start us off.
Okay, so I think I want to specifically have 2 weapons, not 1.
Oh, my.
And I say this because you have to have a subversive conflict going on for, noir detective stuff to work. So I'm thinking that this may be like a Romeo and Juliet situation where you have
Ooh.
a mob boss who is in a bitter cold war with another mob on the other side of town, across the river or across the railroad track. But this mob boss's niece or something has found herself in a romantic secret relationship with the son of the other mob boss's family.
Of course.
So rather than like doing the Romeo and Juliet where, 2 houses are both alike in dignity and then learn to love each other at the end of the story, our story begins when they realize that both of them are dead
Ooh.
and they have not learned their lesson.
Did we leak this to you before? Did you just have this ready to go?
I mean, you gave me the prompts, so I'm rolling with it. Do I need to let somebody else have a turn, or am I?
Not at all. This is a great starting point. I'm loving this already.
Okay.
Just let him solve it all himself.
Yeah, right? Like we don't even need to do anything. This makes our job much easier, I have to admit.
Okay, so you have obviously you're gonna have a Tommy gun, right? And you've got the extremely brash other cousin or nephew who, catches wind of the whole thing, and this is where the fury really starts to come out.
Okay,
Because
here we go.
he just goes totally like insane. I'm going to eliminate anybody in this family who even came close to touching my little cousin. Like you put your hands on her, everybody has to burn. So he is on a mass rampage, and
And I
then
imagine that's where our detective comes in, right?
and then he mysteriously dies.
Oh.
Ooh.
He
Okay.
gets
Okay.
stabbed to death with a letter opener
Mm.
multiple times.
Okay.
And the whodunit is who stabbed him with the letter opener.
Okay. So we've got the conflict.
Interesting.
So that's where I'm going to leave it.
That's where we're going to start. Daniel, help us make sense of all this here. What do you got for us here?
Boy.
Yeah.
What can we expand on the setting itself? Like the location it's happening in?
I mean, it's a cold, dark night in Noiropolis.
Like, is this a modern setting, a sci-fi, a fantasy? Because it's noir, but this could be in multiple
Oh,
places.
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Mhm.
Well, I hear noir and I immediately,
Chicago, 1942, like something like
yeah,
that.
exactly. Like, like I think of Casablanca, or I
Yes.
think of oh, don't take my nerd card away from me. What's the movie?
Maltese Falcon,
No, not Maltese Falcon is a good one. I'm thinking of
Blade
the
Runner.
Blade Runner. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fine.
But yeah, either of those, that's where I go. So this is up to you. This is
Okay.
your decision. I feel like, Daniel. Where are we?
I think it should be something unexpected.
Ooh.
Um, like I can't even think of a noir fantasy. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of noir fantasy. I'm trying to think of what if you did like a sword and sorcery noir fantasy?
Hmm. Hmm.
Something really unusual.
I think we can go that route. So we've got a sword and sorcery type thing. How sword and sorcery do we really want to go with it here exactly?
Can we go? I don't mean to interject, but can we go sword and sandal?
Yeah, why
Sword and
not?
Oh,
sandal,
yeah.
yeah,
Nice.
absolutely.
Because then we can keep your weapon, sort of. Maybe it's not a Tommy gun. Maybe
I
it's
was
like
gonna say not the Tommy gun. Yeah.
maybe it's like what was that steam powered machine gun we had talked about in the past? I don't know.
Or maybe he just went with like a crossbow on a rampage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
See, okay, let's clarify sword and sandal for everyone here, because when you say sword and sandal, that to me implies like ancient Greek, but maybe we're on different pages here. What are we talking
Yeah,
about?
anything from like 500 BCE to 50 AD.
Gotcha. Okay. So in my mind, this cousin is just hurling pylums pretty much everywhere. Like anyone who's in the way is just getting to pile him through the chest. That's where my
Right.
brain goes. All right, so I love that idea, because now this to me honestly sounds like the setup for a Trojan War. This to me is not Romeo
Ooh.
and Juliet. It's the goddamn Trojan War. That's what I'm trying to say. That's where I'm starting out, and that's what I would like to kind of toss in there. I think that's a great way that we can start it too. Daniel, excellent idea trying to pivot away from the traditional setting. I like that a lot.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's good.
oh, yeah, of course.
So what do we've got a Trojan War situation going on. What are the stakes? What are the stakes that we're looking at here exactly? Is it the brink of total war, or is it something else? Something perhaps more
What if it's happening in the city ahead of the Trojan horse?
Oh.
And so the issue is like they don't want the populace to just like murder each other completely
Mhm.
before they have a chance to actually defend the city.
I love that idea. I love the idea that the war is completely, it's like Baron kind of alluded to, it's like Casablanca, where the war is in
Mhm.
the background.
Yeah.
It's never off screen, it's always in the background because there's this other story that is taking place that is much more important. And the focus is on these characters. And yeah, the war's there. It's going to happen. It's definitely coming. We're going to feel the implications of it. But we're really focused on Humphrey Bogart here. Like that's the type of thing that I think if you have interfamily conflict and it's like, hey, this is really taking away from the war effort. We should really pay attention to that giant horse they just parked
Mhm.
inside.
Mhm.
Like I think that's a really cool way that we can kind of approach this thing too.
And then for a main character, what if we kind of continue to flip the noir thing and have a female main character? Maybe she's a priestess or something to that effect,
Oh, I like that.
who's been kind of brought in some way.
Absolutely.
That would make sense because like she's an oracle who has been brought in
Ooh, there we
Mm.
and is
go.
trying to decipher what the heck happened. Why is this man who went on a rampage killed? And
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm. I like that.
I wonder then if the villain needs to have a way of countering an oracle's power, especially if we're talking about a mystery where that's critical to the narrative working.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
well, does the oracle actually have power?
Oh, I
Well,
like
that's
that.
always
Mhm.
that's always the
It
question.
is, yeah.
Of course, yeah. Well, I love where we are right now. I'm really, really digging this. So I think that it's time to, kind of throw a monkey wrench into things and roll for the twist. So we're gonna roll on the twist list and see what happens. All right, according to the twist list, the world is much smaller than you think.
Hmm.
Now we can interpret that in any way that we want to. what are our first thoughts?
That the Oracle was the one who killed him, and she doesn't remember.
Ooh,
Oh.
Damn.
She has amnesia for some reason.
interesting.
Okay. Are we talking about like spirit possession? Is it like that type of thing?
I have no idea.
Well, have we decided who the villain really is?
No.
No, not yet.
Okay. I mean, if the Oracle is the villain, then what is the reason why the Oracle has forgotten what she knows?
Well, maybe the Oracle themselves aren't the villain, but they were like controlled or maybe like possessed during because I'm thinking traditional Oracle of Delphi, they're sitting over these volcanic fumes and inhaling, right? Like what happens if this third party kind of sprinkles something else that is essentially, like bath salts into that day's kind of mystical offerings, and suddenly there's a mind control element or there's something a little bit more magical going on.
Yeah, or what if and maybe this could be related too, but what if a god gets involved actually who's like
Yep.
on the opposing side and they're the one that set this whole thing in motion.
I feel like if that's the case, we're really playing into like the Greek tragedy aspect
Mhm,
of it.
mhm.
And that is something that I really love and would love to like nail down for sure.
It would seem that there's some politics then happening on the divine side.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Are these warring mobsters, are they actually opposing religious institution? So
Yes.
is
Mhm.
one worshiping, Bacchus and the other worshiping Zeus or, some Babylonian god Ur? Is that my Babylonian
Mm.
mythology is
Well, we
terrible.
could do Marduk if we want to go,
Yeah.
or Tiamat if we want to keep it traditional D&D, even though I know they're
Yeah,
completely different. That's not, it's just a joke. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting way. Do we want to approach it as though they're completely competing pantheons, or do we want to approach its interpantheonic conflict? I think I made that word up, but you get what I'm trying to get at here,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
like
Yeah.
interpantheonic
Me
because
too,
then
yeah.
it's closer to home, you
It
know?
is a good made up word, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Internecine conflict, is that how they say it? Internecine.
You know what? Okay, so it's within the same pantheon. This conflict, I,
Sure.
I understand that much. Uh, where can we end it? What's the kind of resolution point here?
Oh.
I mean, I guess the priestess would probably have to find out the ultimate truth and
Hmm. Suffer the consequences. It's a Greek tragedy,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
so it's
Oh,
the suffering
probably
of the consequences.
yes.
gouge her eyes out or something, like
That just because that happens in one out of every three Greek tragedies doesn't mean that it happens here, Courtney.
Is the Oracle really complicit?
Oh, so we get like a Kaiser Soze moment where it's like, oh, I was manipulated this whole time, and in actuality, they're actually the ones who's behind it, and they like defect.
Yeah, I would really like if the Oracle has some agency in the end and that she realizes that
Mhm,
she's technically the killer, but she also knows there's a conspiracy against her. And so part of the
Mm,
adventuring party's goals would be to side with the Oracle and really get back at whatever divine comedy is being played on them.
mhm, mhm.
Hmm. I like that.
that's interesting. That's fun. I like this idea that the Oracle is somehow playing all of the sides against one another in some way.
Or even, yeah, even for her own survival.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's cool, and it does play into, like, the femme fatale kinda thing.
yeah.
Hmm.
Everyone loves a good femme fatale, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
For sure. Those are my favorite kind of characters.
Yeah, understandably. I think that we've got this amazing setup. I think that we leave the ending, I think we leave it unresolved because I feel like that would implore people to offer us their own endings to this type of story, right?
Mm.
Oh, and I mean, if we're gonna world build for RPGs, we should leave it to the players.
Of course, you got to have
Mhm,
open
mhm.
hooks all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Right.
The least safe fishing store of all time. Okay. And with that, we're going to conclude the world building jam. That was really fun. I love some of the twists and turns that we took there. Now it's time for the lightning round where we just blast questions at you really quickly. Baron, my wife wants to know, is cereal a soup?
Cereal is not a soup.
Mhm, mhm.
All right. Baron, what have you been playing recently?
What have I been playing? Mouse Ritter? That's about it.
Gotcha. And Courtney and Daniel, jump in with yours.
What was your most unexpected failure in an RPG?
Ooh.
Oh man. To what's the word I'm looking for? My most unexpected failure would have been to misunderstand the amount of emotional investment my players had in my own world building.
Oh
Ooh.
yeah.
Wow.
That is a great piece of advice for anyone. Daniel, do you have a rapid fire question?
My favorite classic question is, what is your favorite character death? And that is a character that you played.
Oh, I thought we opened it up so it can be one that you just witnessed.
Well, I'd like to know if he has one of his own that got killed that
Gotcha.
he.
Gotcha.
I have never played a character that has died, and I've only played like as a player probably less than 24 times.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
then we have no choice but to see a witness death.
Yes.
So yeah, a witness death. I was playing in a campaign that was about 2.5 years long in the making, and I had sent them on a number of time traveling MacGuffin quest fetching type of ordeals, and it was very obvious that the players were nearing the end of the story. And it was a time travel epic about how vampires were using a magical device in order to control the celestial sphere and cause an eclipse to happen
Hmm.
24/7. That was the vampires' goal. And the players were in a dungeon on one of the last MacGuffin hunts in order to stop this from happening, and they got into a conflict with some of these vampire underlings. And just on a random table, like earlier that game session, they were in a crypt, and they went looking through some of the sarcophaguses and were like, I want treasure. What's in these places? What's in this one? "Oh, I don't know. Here, I'll just roll on the random 5e thing," and gave the guy a filter of love, which,
Wow.
that's totally random. I was like,
Hmm.
I don't know what this guy's going to do with this. Well, we get to, the air quote boss fight room, and the players are having a knockdown drag out. And, I think everybody's like level 11 or 5e. So they're pretty durable. But like everybody is just really struggling, and tons of spells are going off. Water is, somebody has created a crap ton of water. I can't remember what the circumstances of it was. It was to try and like flood the room and make it difficult terrain. And then another cleric comes in and starts casting control water to shift the water back and forth underneath the vampire's feet so that they're standing in effectively to them acid. Super, super clever. And one of the players drops while the water is rushing over their body.
Oh, yep.
And because they're on death saves, we inferred some mechanics and decided, okay, you lose some failures, like this should be bludgeoning damage, give me con saves for drowning, etc., etc. And the dice were just against this character. It wasn't working. And that entire campaign we played for nearly 2.5 years, that was the only character death that whole campaign.
Wow.
Wow.
And we were
Wow.
probably 4 weeks out from concluding the campaign with an epic story.
Oh.
Jeez.
And I remember like the whole thing stopped. Like everybody at the table was just like aghast. Like you could hear a pin drop. Nobody talked for probably 3 minutes. And Tanya, the girl who was playing the character who died, like I saw tears welling up in her eyes. And Chance, the guy who I had given the filter of love to, was like, screw this. I take the filter of love and I cram it down the vampire's throat. Make your save. And I was like, okay. I make the save. I had no idea where it was going. And he failed the save and he became the best friend of the party because he drank the filter of love. And they were like, help save our friend. And the vampires stopped the combat and carried the dead body out of the dungeon. And she showed up, this character, I allowed it to return 6 sessions later at the final boss fight as a vampire. And I gave the character sheet back to the player who originally was running it. And I was like, you get to decide. Are you on the side of the vampires, or are you on the side of the players? So she was a vampire. She had some cooler abilities. She was like 1 or 2 levels lower because her character died at that time, but she got pulled into the ranks
That's
of the
amazing.
vampires
Yeah, that's
because of
awesome.
that filter of love. And like that whole story about the character death and just how it evolved over the next 6 sessions, total blast.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I love that.
It's the power of the game. I love it.
Yeah,
Absolutely love it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was all just because of one dumb random magic item that I don't have mental fortitude to think about this right now. You've asked me 17 million questions. Here, have a filter of love.
Some impressive problem solving on their part too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I miss playing with that group. A lot of them have, scattered to the winds. 2 of them have moved to Europe,
Mm.
and we're adults and life has just happened. But I will still occasionally text that group and just thank them for like the best Dungeons and
Oh.
Dragons I have ever played by far in my life. It's phenomenal.
And on that note, are any of them content creators? Because my next question is, who is someone you would love to shout out who is not yourself? Maybe an author or a content creator, someone who you don't think gets enough love and deserves more eyeballs on their project.
No, for sure. I'd like to shout out 2 people, if you don't mind.
Oh my God, this has never happened before.
If you are into terrain making for your Dungeons and Dragons game, like if you're just crafty or artistic at all, I have found that probably the most refreshing and colorful crafting projects on YouTube come out of Frankie D. Crafter. Check him out. Everything he makes is just completely whimsical and cartoony and cheap and easy. And you'll think to yourself, I could never paint something like that. But if you just do what he does, like you can have some crazy Aztec ruins for your players to fight goblins on if you use miniature D&D game. Amazing stuff. Secondly, I would ask everyone to check out the Kickstarter projects by Bolt Neck Opossum. I've become pretty well acquainted with some of those guys. It's 2 gentlemen. Their latest project, oh gosh, they're gonna kill me because I can't quite remember the name of it. But it is a project that like really dives into the biological diversity of like how would races develop their culture based on like the certain ramifications and like really leaning into the ramifications of their own biology. So, if constructs never forget anything, what does that mean? Like, does that make them an extremely begrudging race? Because they never forget everything like it was yesterday. They have a perfect memory. And they have most of their projects are very small, OSR-ish, like zine type format content. But their second publication is really thought provoking. So yeah, check both of those guys out.
Fantastic. And our final question, Baron, where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, I am only on YouTube. I have not got myself to try anything. I don't really even want to get onto Twitter. That just sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, knowing my personality.
It is. Yeah, that's
Understandable, yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, you can look me up at Dungeon Masterpiece on YouTube.
Fantastic. All right. Baron de Ropp, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real blast.
Thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
And we're back. I'm sure that geopolitics is not necessarily for everyone, but I had a fucking blast talking about that type of stuff because I think it's the type of storytelling that I'm really interested in. And like I said in the interview, I find that type of universal kind of core concepts that we're talking about to be like the creative fuel that really gets me going. That's definitely one of my favorite things about that.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I do think there's a lot to say for the believability aspect, the realism aspect that it brings when you bring these concepts into like some completely fantastical world, as long as you have these ideas that are based on human civilization, then it all makes sense somehow.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite things I think that we talked about, and Daniel, I'll give you credit for this, for bringing it up, is the idea of finding a way to make your fantastical races feel more alien. I thought that adding the geopolitical thing into it was a really great way
Agreed.
to add that flavor and difference.
Yeah, I think what's valuable when we think about world building is making sure we have toolkits available, right?
Mm,
So,
Mhm.
when we're talking about Justin Alexander, we have toolkits for building the nodes that structure your scenario, right? When we
hmm
talk to a CRO, and we get toolkits for building magic systems, and here we have
hmm
like toolkits almost for building the reason why your civilization is where it is and why they have these relationships with each other. So it's like the more people you can read who give you toolkits, like the
Mm,
better, because whether you
Mhm.
use the tool or not is up to you, but it gives you the options to really flesh out, like Courtney was saying, to really give your fantasy some believability.
absolutely. Very well said, Daniel.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of World Build with us. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. All right. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then I've got more things to plug. Again, a big thank you for Baron de Ropp for joining us for this week's episode. Remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, where if you follow the link, do all the stuff, we will build your world within a reasonable amount of time. If you want to follow us on social media, we're over at Let's World Build. If you want to come join our Discord and chat about world building or, anything in particular, you can always follow the link for that in the description. And if you're feeling particularly generous or you just want access to our sweet patron only episodes, you can follow the link for that in the description as well. That'll do it for this episode of World Build with us. Remember that we love you very much, and we're going to get through this together. Until next week.